Okay, so let's create a new branch and call this Authenticated routes. For our next one. So what do we basically have in store here? So we created the sign up and the login. Now, okay, my session's still running. The next thing that I probably wanted to do is to say, well, is this really something that I can do when I'm already, logged in? Why would I basically say that? So in our sign up, in both actually, right? So what we basically have here, if you remember correctly, then we have in our index PHP, we have these generate routes, and we also have the startup included, which basically starts the session. Right, so we slowly get to the point where we kind of wonder, well, what kind of other general functionality do we need on a very high level? So let's for now basically write that here as well and say retrieve session. Key. Okay. And what I want to do here is basically say, okay, if I set session key, then return session key. All right. Else, I would want to probably return false. So let's do that in a little bit more simple form here and say, okay, so if this actually exists, then do it, right? Else false. Let's make use of the sloppiness of PHP by not being type safe. So our retrieve session is basically something that we now can read everywhere we are because we declared it as a global function, which again will probably not be the case forever, but for now that's what we're going to do. I'll drink a little bit of my tea here. Move this over. This time I need a little bit of a better grasp on people chatting because I kind of missed that the last time. Okay, so let's see what we want to do here. So in our retrieve session, what we basically now have is I can now always ask for this wherever I am, right? So including in my actual navs if I want to. Now, and in that case, I do want to. So what I basically want to have, what we haven't done yet, is creating a logout, right? So let's do that maybe and say, okay, so what we want to do is generate this. And what I'm going to do is to be super lazy here and say, hey, what this generates, let's actually look at this quickly. What this generates, or how that looks like, where are we? Right, is that we get this /login here. And what I can do is, of course, say, well, what if I simply add a get parameter here? Right, that would say logout. Right, what would that do? And as you can see when I hover it, I don't know if you can see that, but then basically I get to the login page with a logout of equals true. So let's maybe do that here quickly. And so here we have our if user, then you're logged in. and at the same time, if post user, then do the login. And what I also want to do here is, of course, to say, well, maybe this, right? Where I say you are logged out. And here I want to say, well, if not session user, but actually if get logout. Okay, and then I destroy the session, right? Unset session user. Okay, so let's see what that does. Bum, you're logged out. Okay, so now I can basically log in again. But the issue with that is, of course, that if I post to the same thing, so that's where it gets a little bit tricky. So this is still set. See that? So if I actually go and log in now, I am logged in, but at the same time, since I posted here, I basically unsetted it first. So if I go to sign up, it doesn't look like I'm logged in because I'm actually not, right? Or I actually am, because this runs and then resets it again. Okay, actually this doesn't really matter. The question that we need to figure out is how reliable is the session. So here in the sign up, I should have a little bit of an if here. So what I'm going to do in my main, so super high on top here, I'm planning to basically show this login, logout, and so on, depending on whether or not the user's logged in. In order to do that, I go to my index and say, okay, so this whole, where are we? Our complete output here needs to basically know, right? So here in this main, needs, not in this main, yeah, yes, in the main, needs to know whether or not we're logged in or out. So I'm also going to say user is, and then I say retrieve, no, how do we call this? Retrieve session user. Okay, so if I do that and then go to my main and say, well, so I can iterate over this, but I can basically create a little bit of ifs here, right? So let's jump back, and here I can basically say, oh, you know what, I'm actually gonna make it easier. Show on, show true. Basically do that. Yeah, that's maybe an easier solution. Okay, but what I actually want to do here is to basically say, well, is set session user. Right? Actually, the about will always be there. I changed the wrong one. So the sign up. Okay. So this I'm going to set to true. So this will always show the about. The home will also always show. The sign up will only show if there is no logged in user. The login will only show if there is no logged in user, and the logout will show only if there is a logged in user. Okay, let's see if that works. So if I go to about, so now everything, oh, this actually does not work. Oh, because, yeah, so here we forgot. So this has an if. So we want to show this depending on show, right? If nav dot show. Right, let's check this out. Okay, so now I'm logged in, so only the logout shows. And hey, Mr. M. Huckm. So basically now I can basically say, okay, those is a very, very primitive form of authentication, right, of authenticated routes. So what we now can do is to say like, okay, so let's just log out and see what happens. Perfect. So we've gotten back to our login form. You are logged out. And if we log in now, we can see that we're still on the same route, right? Which is probably something that we kind of don't want to do, because why would we stay here, right? So the next step is probably to say like, okay, let's drop it back to depending on where we came from. Okay, so there are a couple of things now, because if we came from this logout, then actually let's not go into history, that's too complicated. We're going to make that static and just drop you on the home page. So in my login, basically here in my do login, what I can do is here in this you're logged out, I'm simply going to say, okay, I'm going to hardcore redirect you with a location, right? And where's this location going to be? Well, pretty simple. I'm going to use my app root. No, what did I call it? What did I call it? App web root. Yeah, that guy. I'm not sure why this is. Because I need my getenv. And this here I actually don't have any kind of automation for that. So that should basically do. Getenv missing. Yeah, right. Right. You know this code base better than I do, apparently. So let's basically see. Let's play this through a little bit. So let's log out and then log in, and perfect. Now we're basically where we want to be. Now there are a couple of more things when we talk about cleanup. So as you can see, we have a couple of messy things here that are kind of like convoluting the space that we want to see here. So if I'm looking at a login, I kind of want to have an overview of, okay, what's happening here, right? So we talk about cognitive load here. And all of those ifs make it a little bit hard to grasp with one little view or one little glimpse of the code base of what's going on. So what are the different cases, right? The different cases are basically, okay, so a logout that's on the same container. So to clean that up, of course, a cleaner solution would be to create a controller for that. But we basically, want to have this working right now pretty out of the box. Then here, okay, we already started to say like, okay, why don't we put those into functions here, right? So here in the username, you can basically see that pretty easy. And it's also important that that runs before any of that is running. So what do we do here? What we probably do here is just have a little bit of a cleanup here, where we're going to say, okay, check actions, right? Let's call it like that. And that is basically something that we are going to do. So I'm going to say here this check actions. And so first thing we're going to do is to basically say, okay, if this is the case, and by the way, let's already plan in advance a little bit. So again, this is going to move out here from the global scope. And that's why I'm kind of hesitant to basically use it right here, because as soon as we need a third function here, we probably will realize that this shouldn't be here. We need some form of general helper to basically facilitate, stuff that lives as global as this. So for now, I'm going to just say like, okay, let's live with it and put it right there. And the logout is basically something that I don't like to be in this namespace at all, right? So what I'm probably going to do is to say, no, let's create a different function for this, right? So check actions, let's for now call it like like this, and then we probably notice that, okay, check logout, that we probably want to rename that as well. So let's move that basically down here. All right. And then the only thing that we want to do is basically to say, okay, so if the login works, if somebody tries to log in, then do the login. So at that point, we noticed that, okay, hold on a second. Why don't we just say, make this a little bit more logical, and say check login, and instead of check action, we're going to call this check auth. And then we have basically all of those, and we just have to place this if, right, basically right here, right, where we say, okay, this is what's happening in the case that somebody's actually logging in at the moment. Now, if we do that, then basically from our how we read it, right, you get the feel free to be more specific than no, by the way. We can basically say, move it out of the if again. No, more specific means with a concrete reasoning and what's it called? An example. And then make it the if not, and return. No, so yes. So let's quickly do what I have planned, because then you see what the stream of consciousness is. So if you make it like this, right, and say, okay, this check logout, and then you say this check auth, and then you say this check login, then you have a couple of advantages. What is the advantage? The advantage is that if this code base grows, what we want to do is all of those have side effects, right? So the order of how we execute any of those checks is pretty important. What does that mean? Well, so if I basically say here, if it says session users, then you're logged in. This is something that happens twice. Do you see that? And then the question is, why would it happen twice? I mean, here it actually doesn't matter because we're redirecting now, so we don't need it anymore anyway. But of course, it makes a difference which I run first. So especially if you're doing sloppy stuff like the get, right? So here in the logout, do you see how we just set it to the get? So if we're signing in, our form right now is directly posting, right? We're not using any kind of JavaScript. So if our logout check would run after our login check, then what would happen is that basically, okay, the login would work. I would set the session, then the logout would run, right? If this were like this, and then we would basically log ourselves out again in the same move. And that is something that is avoidable. Well, first of all, of course, I mean, we will notice that to move that out in the first place. But for now, it makes sense to say, well, at least what we can do is to say, okay, what happens when, from a cognitive perspective, write how it's happening in the order. Yes, you're right. In that case, it would redirect first, but who knows if that's going to stay, right? But it's more about, like Mr. M. Holcomb. This is more about avoiding mistakes while you're developing. To basically make sure a lot of spaghetti code that I've seen basically happens because the consecutive order of what happens first, what happens then, and so on is something that beginners really easily lose overview of. And if before you abstract your stuff, if you basically go into at least say, well, I'm following the order of what happens in a consecutive way, it makes it very easy to also to debug, right? Okay, but instead of if set, then if not code. Instead of if, wait, let me actually change the view here quickly so people kind of see a little bit better what's happening here. Twitch's not making spaces like I type. Yes, well, I hope so, because that is not really formatted at all. Okay. Return code. Okay. Let's see what we're talking about here. So what you mean is that if a cleaner if approach, and basically saying like, well, couldn't this look like if not, then go home, right? Is that what you mean? Yeah. Okay, let's talk about that quickly. There's no functional difference in here, of course. What makes this pattern pretty useful, and that's probably why it's recommended, is that you basically say, hey, ideally, and this is a little bit of a trick to write cleaner code, is ideally you define your logic in a way that completely avoids any kind of actually else's, if you want so. If you try to avoid else's, as I mean, that's not always possible and isn't always the most logical way. But if you have that kind of process thinking, then you basically say, let's get rid of everything that's kind of in the way, right? Everything that's blocking. So if we basically say, hey, none of this is executed, right? If I get all of the other cases out of the way, then it's more logical. And then the second thing, it doesn't get deep, right? You can see that basically, okay, now we already saved ourselves one indentation, which basically means in a more complex scenario, you kind of save yourself also from those kind of dangerous, like it gets deeper and deeper and deeper. Yeah, and you could return after the header, then this else would also die. Correct. I actually wouldn't even need, so same principle here, right? So let's just say if this is not, then let's just return true, right? We're not capturing anything here anyway, so it really doesn't matter what we return here. This is void. And then here we basically say, okay, do we really need this? Right? We can even make this return nothing, void return. Yeah, but I mean, we're returning into the void, if you want so, right? It really doesn't matter what we return here. And of course, you can do the same here and say like, okay, so how can we simplify this even more, right? So this is the only thing that's actually relevant for us. So if we were to say, okay, here, return true, and then we wouldn't need any of that anymore, so we don't need the else, right? And that, of course, works. And there are a lot of those little things, but I actually don't really want to spend too much time on it. And would actually more like to focus on, so how do we now operate on authenticated systems in the most basic way? Because what we still need to do is to kind of say like, okay, so what do we do with this knowledge? So here, like, can I, for example, now say, hey, maybe you shouldn't be able to create a post unless you're logged in, right? And that's probably why I ultimately do this. So let's look at it a little bit deeper. Sorry, I'm just confused with that chat message. But it's easier for beginners and for more experienced people to follow along, right? Just no idea what you mean by that. To follow along what? Oh, you mean if you get rid of the depth? Oh yeah, right. Anyway, so yes, let me see. So now we basically say, okay, so since we can retrieve it, let's go back to our very first post controller and say in our, that's, where am I here? Hold on, that is not my post controller, my home controller. Here we basically say, well, okay, so we get the posts, we get the base, but what we didn't get yet is to basically say, well, this is an authenticated route. And since we don't have any kind of things that we automatically construct in here, which we might get to the point of defining that on the router base, and then basically have something that, we would have like a middleware pattern. But what we're going to do instead is we're going to decide right here that, okay, so user is the retrieve session user. Okay, so I can either basically read now the public information on the user, which in that case will only be our username. That's all we basically have given this, and or basically at the same time this will give us, if it's false, we know that the user is not logged in. So in our home HTML, right, we can now basically say to our create new post, we can, this whole form we can basically take out and say, well, that's an nif user, and of course here we can basically say, well, if that's not the case for whatever reason, I'm going to give it a button. I'm going to create a button, which will actually be an A in our case, with the class, and I still forgot how this thing works, but thankfully my ID knows it, and then I say btn sure primary, and here create my base login, and here I say login to add a post, and in this whole shebang I'm going to say nif not user. Okay, and I'm actually kind of scared if that version of the template can do that, but let's find it out. Let's find it out. Okay, so I'm currently not logged in, so here now it says like, no, you cannot create a post. Okay, fair enough. Let's do that. Now, here comes the important part. Okay, even if you work solely on PHP and have no JavaScript that does stuff like that for you, this is my browser. I can manipulate this as much as I want to, and this is what we're doing here is cosmetics. This does not provide any kind of security whatsoever. Why not? Well, because the actual post, right? So sending something to this, our API, this is not secure whatsoever. So this is just a public post. So even though it looks secure, and unfortunately I see this, in production sometimes, right, where people would have completely open routes. So I can always say, okay, sure, it's more convenient to use this form, but ultimately, if I post towards this endpoint, this will basically execute. So way more importantly, oh, why is this still here? Way more importantly, what I have to do is to say, well, hold on. Any kind of API endpoint that we have generated is something that we definitely need to secure as well, right? So let's think about like how our router works again. So the post is something that we define in our, where did we put that again? In our, did we put that in startup? Where's our router? Do we still have that in, do we still have that in our index? No, we have got that out, right? All right, we put that in base. Ah, we already created a base. Okay, cool. So here we basically go, and let me see how we retrieve that. And this is fully automatic. Yeah, okay, let's do this in the same way and say, well, if we get to any kind of hooks or middleware that runs before, let's do that all at once. So for now, I'm going to do the exact same thing that I did on login. And I'm going to go to my post and say, well, I'm not going to try this if you're not logged in, right? So what I'm probably going to do is I'm going to have a general answer. And this answer basically goes to say no. This is not happening in general, and that's what I return. Right? Always, always. And basically, if I can then say, well, so if not, retrieve, how do we call it? Retrieve session user. Return answer. Right? So now this will not execute unless we basically have an active session. And that's basically what we should, for now, never forget that just because we have any kind of differences on the front end, right, or on the view, so to speak, that the actual security never has anything to do with what's happening in either HTML or JavaScript. That is just to tell the user what he has officially access to. With our other routes, it doesn't matter, right? Whether or not you want to sign in again, even though you're signed in, well, so be it. But here is the first time we actually want to talk about how do I secure the backend. Now let's quickly see why this is still showing up. And I guess that's because I cannot write it like I wished I did. Where's my home? Then let's see if that works. Nope. Let's quickly see something. Let's quickly see something different here so I understand what I see here. Username. Does this work? I don't even remember if that works. Lol. Okay, that does not work. Playing around here a little bit. Huh. Interesting. Okay. Hold on. I have to actually look into this, huh? I haven't used this library for such a long time. Let's say if we're going to make a little bit of a trick here, right? And for now, I'm kind of going to fake this, and this is a very ugly solution. But I know now that this either renders to nothing or a particular string, right? So what I can do is to say like, okay, this should evaluate, right? This is a bit of a under the hood hack. Let's see if that even works. Yeah, thought so. And then let's log out and see if it shows up again. Nope. Let's check how it renders. Let's check how it renders. Where is it? Yeah, okay. this is apparently, okay, so user set, users this, why is this not rendering empty? I'm super curious now, sorry, this is a little bit of a detour, but just want to see what's happening. Just want to see what's happening. Actually, let's do the following. Let's do the following quickly. Aha, then it's not filled. Okay. Okay. And then user is not set at all. And what do we paste in here? Retrieve session user, and this does what? False. Aha. And false apparently does what? If it's false. Is that as a string or is it interpreted? Oh. I need to get this out again. Empty string. Are you kidding me? Hold on. Oh, because that's not okay, because that's on XPath level. Yes. Yes. Okay. I see. I see. So in that case, it should be possible to simply say if user equals false. Right? No, because then it's empty, but that works. Ah, that's a tricky little one here. Oh, I'm not logged in anyway. This is the interesting part. It's unset returns false, and the if should interpret it actually as a. Am I going crazy? Yeah, apparently. I have to look into that a little bit. Actually, right now. Actually, right now. Where is that? That looks overall. Let me quickly read the README here. What? Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. So how do we have, so user is then in this case false, and which means this should work. This should actually work. Why doesn't it? It's really fascinating. Bothers me now to the point where I have to look into this library and see if there's an issue with it. Let me write that down quickly. Okay. So, well, in that case, login to the post. In that case, basically we say what are we saying here? How do we circumvent this now? Let's just say if not user ID. Hello. Okay. Let's just make sure that that works. Okay. Lol. Okay. Got it. Got it. Then this crap happens. Wonderful. I cannot even circumvent the issue right now, which is wonderful. Okay, let's ignore this for now because that's something that I don't want to waste time with right now. But nonetheless, it's very annoying, especially if I look at my home. No, my main, right? Why does it work in here? Right, so in my index I do basically the same thing. So here give it a true or false. And it works like a charm. It's because that's an array, huh? Huh. Interesting. Let's try something out. No, whoops, we're here. If I go to my home PHP and say logged in, and say do exactly the same thing, so it's only Boolean, and basically say, okay, get me the session user, and then go back to this and say if not user, sorry, what did I call this? Logged in. What happens then? Okay. Yeah, okay, interesting. Okay. The more you know. The more you know. Okay, I kind of lost a little bit the track here. What was I doing? Right, yes, so we secured, that was the important part, right? So we secured the front end and the back end accordingly. And of course, what we're kind of missing here is to say like, well, this is super boring. Apparently different users can write something, right? So let's see if we want to capture this. So we want to have a foreign foreign key. In this case, we want to probably have a user ID in our post, correct? So let's basically do that and say, hey, let's modify this table. And let's get the IDs first here and say, hey, by the way, this has a user ID. And we're working with integers, so that's fine. And in our case, we don't want to start with constraints and stuff like that. So we're simply going to add this. And what we're going to do is to say, okay, in our post, let's do the following. So when we answer this create, right, this now has a different logic to it. So our create, oops, where do we even navigate it away from where I want it to go? Here in my payload, I'm going to add basically the user session, right? So in that case, I'm going to do that right here and simply say payload user ID equals, and since I already did this here, I can kind of like sneak this off and say user equals, right? And then can here basically say, okay, user ID. And now I automatically insert it there. And in my post view, wherever I have that, oh, that's in my home. When I iterate over my posts, after the content, maybe at the end here somewhere, right? I want to have, oh, there's probably something as a card footer. Oh, there is. It's already in here. It's instead of the click me, let's maybe say there's nowhere to click, but there's a little by. And then here we're going to say post. Oh, sorry. Now we only get the user ID. But yeah, let's start there. Let's start there before we see how we can connect stuff. Tissue 78. Would you say you are a clean coder? On most days, yes. Why? Why? What makes you ask that? Probably takes a while for an answer. Clean coders are rare. Yes, and yes, and see, it's also something that everybody fights with for forever, right? I'm never happy with commit messages, separation. I mean, basically, I could look at a project that I've built a year ago and then keep on refactoring it for the next 5 years. And I think that's pretty normal. It's more, and by the way, this is not so much the non plus ultra when it comes to clean code, what you're seeing here. It's more of getting there, right? So we basically going to notice that, okay, so now we need something again, then we're going to apply the dry principle and say, well, okay, should we move that out and abstract that? So this is more of a process of, okay, how do clean code bases come about, rather than the idea of saying like, well, we're going to write it perfectly from scratch, right? Just so you can put that into context a little bit. Let's move on. So I lost my train of thought again. I'm not very well concentrated today. So in the post, yes. So we should basically be already able to see that. But I mean, unfortunately, what we will see is I'm probably going to clean this up here quickly, just so we have a little bit of a cleaner space, and basically say, where's my database tools? Truncate. Boom. Okay, so that's gone. And now let's see how we can combine that. So if I reload this, you will notice that, okay, this is completely empty. We've not accounted for that being empty, but that's okay. So I'm going to say first post, and my content is my first content, and go. Okay, so now we basically have that here, and now I can basically see by one. Okay, so now this is the first time, right? If you look into what we're doing here, right? That we say like, okay, now our models become a little bit more complicated, because what do we do with the user ID? That's pretty useless. Now let's open up a complete new discussion of how you want to do this, right? So ideally, you have an added possibility to basically solve those kind of issues on the front end. But again, we're avoiding any kind of front end work here. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the other possibilities we have. So in our post model, right, when we retrieve something, we can of course retrieve something that is a little bit more complex than just the post itself, right? So let's just assume that we have a couple of possibilities. Possibility one would basically be, okay, so what if this is more than one table, which in our case it is. So we could basically say we have a by ID that intakes a particular ID. And this is basically something that everything will basically refer to. Also, all of the other functions will refer to. I will tell you what that means. So let's just assume that we say, okay, so this retrieves a particular post, right? And which post that is so let's get basically everything from post. And we assume that when we call this ID, that this will exist, right? So I'm going to, for now, do it. What the problem with this solution is, we will see in an issue. But let's for now assume that if we're actually calling something from ID, then it will actually exist. And then we say, okay, let's add to this. And simply, instead of making a join to retrieve this all in one row, we want to have it a little bit deeper. So I want to basically attach a completely different model here. Okay, and created a codependency. Again, that's something where we will look into later what that means for potential bottlenecks. But for now, we basically say, oops, no, that's not DB. I'm directly going to require a different model. And that is the user's model, where I will basically say, okay, find, right? And then would put my condition in here. Now at this point I notice, hold on a second, is this something that will work? Because the find will give me an array back. So if we decide to go such a path, then let's open up our users and say, well, hold on, then this must exist here as well, right? Then this seems to be something that we kind of like just need in general. Okay, so let's go as far as just to think this through here and actually build it through. So what I have here with my, would I even have that? Okay, my user is still relatively dumb. So let's just say that always returns here my user, where ID is ID, and I'm always going to take the first result. Okay, so let's assume that that's the case. Then we could now all of a sudden, of course, say, okay, what do we call this? By ID. Sorry, that in that case should be static. In that case should be static, and then we recognize it. And here say, okay, that is our post user ID. Not sure why it doesn't like that. Did we not do that? Same function get by ID. Okay. So let's think it through for a second. What have we done here? So if this is the path we want to go, oh, and there's of course something else that we need. Then this has a bunch of implications. So the first would be, okay, so all of the other functions should basically retrieve the model from this one function, right? Which basically means something like the find wouldn't even do this. It would do something like this, right? Where it says like, okay, let's be a little bit more cautious here and say, okay, just get the ID. And then we basically say for each users, right, as user, and then basically retrieve by the ID. Let's call this IDs. No, let's call this, hold on. Let's call this users. Let me just play around with this a little bit here. And then the IDs, yeah, why not? Let's do it like this for now, because I don't know if that's literally what we want to do. And then we say, okay, is then self by ID, right? Okay, sorry. Okay, so that's how we would do it. But what have we created here? So let's just assume that, okay, the find function would then make one transaction to the database directly, then basically get the actual model definition out, right? So makes a second one, and then makes at least a third one. Who knows how big user is going to be, and who knows what other models users will one day include, right? So that's basically the potential danger of such an approach. So from a use perspective, this is actually pretty easy to handle, right? Because now our single post would basically include the post and the user, which makes it pretty easy to work with. But we already basically have to consider, well, okay, so depending on how many calls users make and how many conditions we're going to get out here, potentially generating here a lot of calls against the database if this becomes a bigger application. So let's keep that in mind, and in the future when we work with working with models on the front end, then we might revise this. What I'm going to do for now is I'm going to look at this and say, okay, we have a new rule for now. There will be a by ID. Okay, let's keep this very simple and say, okay, this must at the moment be the case, right? And then we reconsider. Oh, you're right. And we probably want to give this an ID as well. Okay. So now when we create a model, this is something that we will be kept aware of until we basically find out that probably we want to go about it in a different way. Okay, and then that should be clean. Our users find should do the same. So I'm not going to do that right now because, again, let's see if that's the way we actually want to do this. So if we have done that though, and what we ultimately want to achieve either way is to say like, okay, so our models look like post, and then there's a post user attached to it. So in my view, if I go back to my home, I can of course just say, instead of by, I can say, well, how about user.username? Will that work? And if we didn't make a mistake, which we did, in post find, which let's see why that's the case. So here we get the post ID. Oh, that's why. Okay. Then we basically get directly our user, or in that case here, me, myself, right? And that's basically what we want to achieve. And I think that concludes it so far, right? So we have, what have we done? Let's recap a little bit. So we have basically said, okay, let's create some kind of logic for what we see, right? And have played around with that in various instances. We have basically made decisions on what you see in the browser, so how things are rendered. And we've made decisions on how to basically have a layer between what we post against, in that case only our post endpoint, but that should suffice for now. Which means that this is, well, now has basic security from the standpoint of accessibility to an endpoint and accessibility to the database, right? So we secure it against SQL injection, and we secure it against unauthenticated use. How secure it really is when we work with sessions is something that we probably we're going to get in way later. But for now, this is something that we can kind of rely on, right? Also, how we save the credentials to the database is something that you can really use in production in such a way that's not a concern. Next time we basically going to start thinking about, okay, so what kind of application do we want to build, right? Because right now it just had the posts, but who knows if that is something that we actually want to do, or whether or not we're going to start collecting ideas of what we're going to build here. So far, so good. Thank you so much for watching, and then I guess I see you next time.